Welcome to Wine Soundtrack USA. Listen to the passion with which producers narrate their winery and their world in 30 answers. Discover their stories, personalities, and passions.
Hello, friends and listeners of Wine Soundtrack. This is Allison Levine, and today I am with James Hall, the founder and winemaker of Patz Hall, just a little winery you might have heard of. Anyway, James, welcome, and tell us where Patz Hall is located and a little bit about the winery.
Well, thanks for having me on. The winery is located in Sonoma, California, on a little street called 8th Street East, so we're very close to the town square of the town of Sonoma. And we formed the winery in 1988. Two families, the Patz family and the Hall family. And Donald was doing national sales, and I was doing winemaking, and we realized that if we teamed up, we had a fully complete wine staff. So for 18 years, we made Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, and there were just 4 partners doing all the work. No employees, no vineyards, didn't own a winery, very virtual. And so it was a very interesting ride, but now we've expanded a bit. We have our own winemaking facility, and we have a tasting room, and we have all sorts of things now. But
wow. So do you own vineyards now? And if so, how much do you own, and are you still buying fruit?
So I personally own 2 different vineyards that I sell to the winery, but the winery does not own any vineyards. When we first started, we put in $5,000 each into the winery, and of course that's not anywhere close enough to buying land. And we had a different philosophy because we wanted to make Burgundian-style wines, but we weren't really sure where the best vineyards were. There were a few names, like Hyde Vineyard, which we started with in 1990, that were, quite famous at the time. But we also knew there were an awful lot of vineyards that were being planted in Sonoma that would give us an opportunity to find new terroir. And we thought to ourselves that if we were going to go out and buy a vineyard, first of all, we wouldn't know how good it was because chances are there hadn't been individual wines made. And second, we were a little concerned that if it wasn't as good as we had hoped, we would have tied ourselves to this vineyard and been forced to justify making wines from it. By not owning the vineyard, we were able to have a much clearer-eyed perspective on the quality of the wines. And we knew we wanted to build a portfolio of different single vineyards, and so we wanted very distinctly different terroir. And when you start thinking about owning properties, and we wanted them to be far enough apart that they would have a place inside the portfolio. So now our 2 furthest vineyards are almost 325 miles apart.
Wow.
So we have northern Mendocino, Sonoma Coast, Russian River Valley, Green Valley, Sonoma Valley, Carneros, and Santa Lucia Highlands.
Wow. And your total case production, and generally are your wines available across the U.S. and beyond?
Yes. So this year, 18, we produced 25,000 cases. So that's spread over 22 different wines, however. So one of the things we realized about making lots of small terroir-based wines is that it gets really confusing. And the one thing we heard from every distributor was, we can't explain the differences between all these little wines that have people's family name on them. Can you please make something that is higher in volume that we can have all year long and take to restaurants that want continuity? So we started making Sonoma Coast Chardonnay and Sonoma Coast Pinot. So that's 75% of the production.
Oh, wow.
Those 2 wines. And so the single vineyard wines are literally just a handful of barrels. Some of the Chardonnays are 5 barrels. A 10-barrel lot for us is a significant production. And so that makes finding these special terroirs quite a bit easier as well, because there's a lot of vineyards that are, 20, 30 acres. And when you look at them, they're not all that consistent normally. And there's a little slice in there that's probably got a leg up on the others, and that's what we're aiming for. We want to take the little tenderloin and then focus on that and turn it into its own individual bottle. And so it's exciting because it's a bit of a treasure hunt. It's a great way to build relationships with growers. We want to work with small family growers, so every one of our vineyards is owned privately by a small family farmer.
I love that. And it seems like, so you have these wines, the Sonoma Coast, that are a little more larger production, national distribution, and then once people find you in the markets and in the wine place, they can come seek out the smaller terroir wines. I see the trick there.
I can see you've been practicing your marketing.
Yes. So I'm curious, James, what is your first memory relevant to wine for you?
My father used to buy Almaden Cellars in a jug, 1.5 liters, and he put it on the table, and I'm showing you how old I am. The label had these little pictures of animals around the label, like a chicken and a cow and a goat and all this. And I remember like pointing at the animals going, "That's a chicken." my sister was like, "Good, Jimmy, good." And it had this little picture of a wagon that had little grapes on it. And I remember thinking, wow, that's kind of cool. But what really got me interested in wine was working at restaurants. Huh. I started working in restaurants the day I turned 14. And I was a busboy in an Italian restaurant. And one of my jobs was to fill the artificial plastic barrel that had red, white, and rosé. Uh-huh. And I would open up the gallon jugs and pour it into the top of these little like pull tap things. and I thought, wow, that's sure fun. And I had no idea that my life would be spent putting wine into barrels for the rest of my days. But I ended up a waiter in kind of a posh restaurant in Santa Cruz called Hillary's. And it was in the era of Nouvelle Cuisine, which was an excuse for lots of silverware and glasses and small portions. But it was really the second best restaurant in Santa Cruz, and they had Grand Cru Burgundies and first growth Bordeaux's and vintage champagne. And, you know, it didn't take me long to realize that if I could sell some high-end wine, the check average was really good. And I thought, well, I better learn how to pronounce these things if I'm going to sell them at the table. And my family took us to Europe a couple of times on vacation, and so we had more wine, and it just became something I was interested in. And as I started tasting wine, I was pretty good at it because I was always very, very interested in how things smelled. Like I'd go over to somebody's house, and I think it was kind of rude. I think people thought I was really weird because I'd like start telling them what they had for dinner and, you know, tell them what kind of laundry soap they used and stuff like that. And they were like, what's wrong with you?
It's like a great party trick that you have. I'm going to tell you everything in your house that you've done in the last 24 hours. So I'm curious, you know, obviously you cut your teeth, selling, Burgundy and some top wines. What would you say is one of those aha wines you had? One of those most memorable wines you ever drank, and what was the occasion?
It was in St. Helena. It was 1985, and my partner, Ann Moses, was having her birthday, and we went to a restaurant called Rose and Lefebvre. And Bruce Lefebvre had received a very large inheritance from his dear father and invested it in Burgundies, and he opened this restaurant, and it was one of the best restaurants I've ever been to. Complete labor of love. There were 10 tables. You got the table for the entire night. One strategy was you'd go in for a couple of courses and then go to the movies and come back and finish. His wife at the time was an amazing pastry chef. He had a fromagière, and so we went, and he wouldn't let any of the wines leave, but he had marked them up about 10% from when he paid for them. And so we had a 1966 Clos de la Roche, and it was bloody fantastic. And I was absolutely hypnotized by it. And I thought, I've been tasting a lot of wine around California, but nothing like this. And it was part of a journey of training myself to explore wine. And I sort of approached it as like a study course. One year we went to Spain, and we spent a month in Spain driving around and tasting wines, and I learned about sherry and Albarino. not deep, but
Right.
building some knowledge. And another year, we went to France and spent 2 weeks in Germany. And so I was very fortunate in that my partner is a wine enthusiast. So Ann Moses was a winemaker and sales director at Cane Vineyards. So we had wine in the blood and wine in the relationship, and there was never any doubt about where we were going on vacation.
Well, so, okay, two wine people live together. If we came into your home, what kind of wines would we find? Like, what are you guys drinking, and are you collecting? Are you just drinking? What could we come steal?
So I just built a new wine cellar, and it finished, about 2 years ago now, right before COVID. And I have 9,500 bottles.
Wow.
And so I've been collecting wines since the 80s. Didn't have a lot of money in the 80s, so a lot of second labels and fifth growths and things like that. Not a lot of Grand Cru, I can tell you. But very eclectic. My partner, Anne, her final sales job was representing the Antinoris in the U.S. And so she developed a deep love for Italian wines. And so I would say we had some catching up to do. So I never really understood Italian wine back in the day. And I was fascinated by France and Spain and Germany and all these other things. But I really enjoy particularly Barolos, Longo wines.
Of course you do. You're a Pinot maker.
Yeah. So I'm still learning about how to love wine.
So you have this eclectic international mix at home. Is there anything you opened up recently that drank really well?
Let's see. I opened a bottle of Ulysses Colon vintage champagne recently. That was absolutely spectacular. And then we had, I opened a bottle of 2003 Pichon Lalande, which was really fascinating because, of course, 2003 was considered this disaster. So hot, and it ruined everyone's vacation. And I got a really, really good price on it, so I bought 2 cases of it. And the first few years, I thought, oh my God, why did I do this? It's so bloody tannic, blah, 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 blah. And so I finally came back around to it and opened another one, and I was dancing through the kitchen, so that was really good.
So a little patience, 20 years later, it's drinkable.
Yes, exactly.
So do you think there's a such thing as a perfect variety?
No. Because, first of all, perfection doesn't exist. It's, it's decomposed grapes, first of all. And it's not just the wine. It's about the relationship to the wine. And so a wine that might be, a life-changing event for me could be weirdly funky and acidic and not very delicious for somebody else. Mm-hmm. One thing I really like about wine is that, we make lots of bottles, but each bottle is its own particular universe that has its own journey, and maybe people like it and maybe they don't.
Well, so speaking of that, everyone has a different palate, and, some people like one thing, someone else likes another thing. How do you feel that wine critics and scores play into this? What's your kind of opinion of those?
Well, I think critics play a very valuable role. There is an ocean of wine, and I depend on critics to evaluate vintages, to give me tasting notes, things like that. And I look to critics that I find I have a similar outlook on. And so, let's say Robert Parker, known for, loving really deeply extracted, big, high extract, massive wines. I found that, I didn't like the wines that he was giving 95 points to. I liked the wines he gave 91 points to. And so decoding the critical, literature is very useful when you're collecting wines. But most importantly, you got to learn to just taste and trust your own palate. And for me, just because somebody else liked it and gave it a great score, that's not grounds for me buying it. I want to taste it first.
Right. So you got to trust yourself. So based on your palate, red, white, or rosé?
Well, what's that famous quote? The first obligation of any great wine is to be red. But I started as a white winemaker, and I still feel that if I had to pick one wine out of my cellar to go into a celebrity death match, it would be one of my Chardonnays. Pinot, of course, is it's a very grand variety. It has all sorts of romantic connotations, and as a winemaker, it is, I think, one of the most fascinating grapes to work with. So I'd say some of the wines I'm most proud of have been Pinot Noirs, but the last swallow in my mouth as I go off to the pearly gates is probably going to be a red Burgundy if I'm lucky.
Okay. Still or sparkling wine?
I love sparkling wine. I love acidity. Having cut my teeth on a lot of German wines and Sauvignon Blanc and things, I really like that mineral structure. And I make sparkling wine now. After 30 years of making still wine, I was like, I really got to try something different. And so I set about learning how to make sparkling wine, and it's much more complicated than I thought. So intellectual.
Always up for a new challenge.
Yes. And unfortunately, sparkling wine is so transparent. It is, in my mind, one of the most complex wines to make because everything is absolutely exposed. If there's too much acid or too much bitterness or too much reduction, it's all out there to see. So it's a bit of a high wire act.
Well, I'm enjoying sipping a little bit of your brut sparkling wine right now. Really great acidity, really tart finish. I'm really loving it. And the good thing about Patz Hall is that you don't really have to choose because you make red, white, rosé, and sparkling. So it's a win or win across the board. So I'm curious, with so many wines that you have, how do you approach food and wine pairing? Do you follow rules, or do you do a more come what may attitude?
Well, I think some of the rules are based upon, some practical aspects. I would never say, oh my God, you can't drink that wine with that. The old rule about red wine with fish is, it's BS. To me, it's more about having complementary qualities, not necessarily being a perfect match. And I find that higher acid wines tend to be more flexible. It's more challenging to find foods that go with, big extracted, heavy wines. I always thought, for instance, that one would have red wine with cheese. That's red wine with cheese. Well, I think it's actually more of white wine. And so I remember speaking with a French friend of mine. He goes, what are you talking about? Of course you have white wine with cheese. And I'm like, because here we always have red wine, and you have a nice big hearty red. And he's like, no, you have a light mineral white, sparkling wine even. And so I thought, wow, I'm still learning things.
So really it's, following a level of rules, but also just experimenting and being open-minded, of course. Because when the French want to correct you, you must follow suit.
They have hundreds of years of practice, and as anyone that's not French knows, the French are very eager to correct anybody when they're wrong, and I take their corrections to heart.
So for somebody who hasn't had the privilege and pleasure to taste Patz Hall wines yet, you've told me that you make a lot of different terroir-driven wines, but what do you think they're missing out on by not having your wines yet?
Well, first of all, it's a good glass of wine. So in my book, that sounds simple, but it involves kind of a complex journey. My favorite wines, and those that drink wines with a lot of age on them will certainly appreciate the fact that a bottle of wine is not a single glass of wine. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and every sip or every glass should show something different. It's an evolutionary process, and the great wines, the ones that have really stuck with me, have been consistently evolving for an hour or two, and what the wine tasted like at the beginning of the meal is far different than what it tastes like at the end. And that, to me, is one of the attributes I've tried to achieve with Patz Hall. I've taken very strict Burgundian winemaking techniques and looked at them very, very carefully and tried a lot of different spins and minute changes. But the lesson I learned was that the simpler the winemaking, the more the terroir tends to show. And if I have to start doing a lot of fancy dancing in the cellar, then chances are the vineyard is not one I'm going to have a long relationship with. To me, the best wines come about with the minimal intervention, which is now a cliche, but I still think that's very true. That if you have a great vineyard site and you put the work in viticulturally, that the winemaking should be fairly straightforward.
Well, I know you make 22 different SKUs of wine, but if space aliens were to land at your property right now, which of your wines would you want to welcome them with?
Well, I'd ask them what they were having for lunch. And I probably wouldn't understand it. I have a lot of European wines, and I'd probably start with sparkling wine just to see if they knew how to party. And then,
could be Brut Rosé?
Yeah, or maybe something vintage, with some nice toastiness on it. And then make a pass through Chablis.
I'm talking about your wines.
Oh, my wines.
Yes.
Oh. Well, I would start with Hyde Vineyard Chardonnay. It's my favorite Chardonnay that we make. It ages spectacularly, and it's the Hydes are very dear friends of mine, and so we've done business together and had dinner at each other's houses since 1990. So one of my jobs in life is to help Hyde Vineyards become more famous. So.
So the aliens will get a win-win because it's a famous vineyard and a famous producer. So you've been making wine for a long time now. You're more than 20 years into this. 30 years. I know, I could do my math. 40 years. I'm curious, have you established any rituals that you do, good luck rituals perhaps, at the beginning of harvest?
Well, it all starts with a good cleaning. So I am a little fastidious when it comes to cleaning things. And then I open a killer bottle of champagne. Something, Kruger better.
Ooh.
And we all stand around, and we have a toast, and I give a little speech about how important it is to respect the vineyards and how we're not just making wine, but we're holding this valuable chance to make perhaps one of the best wines in the world. And that motivates people. But it is it's a sacred responsibility for me that we spend all the effort necessary to make the wines as fine as they can be. And so the ritual, starting with champagne, which is a very luxurious and decadent product, is to remind people that greatness does not come easily. And tasting a fabulous sparkling wine, which might be one of the most complex winemaking things you can do, I think represents kind of a goal, and we have one chance to make great wines, and I want to start with champagne.
Ooh, I love that. So speaking of what you're referencing, and just you have this chance every year and that you're looking at it, you've been making wine a long time, and we know that every vintage tells a story, and as you were saying, every place tells a story. Do you see that there's more variation from year to year, or do you see more commonality?
Well, California has a reputation for having very boring weather.
Except when there are fires.
Yes, an increasing worry. But I find that the more eccentric vintages tend to make the more interesting wines. 98 was a great example. 1997, a fabulous year. By all accounts, the critics were, running over word counts to tell how fabulous the wines were. And, 10 years on, they they really were not as exciting as everyone had hoped. But the 98s, which were roundly trashed as one of the worst vintages since '89, were like super interesting, and people were like, how about those 98s? And we made some great wines in '98. So I'm not so sure about what makes a great vintage as I used to be. And I like the eccentric years. But for me, it's not so much about whether the vintage is going to be good or bad, but what little nuance is it going to give to a particular vineyard. And my winemaking is very consistent from year to year. I don't do a lot of variations on a theme. And so I hope there's variation. If the wines were always the same, I think that would be a little bit boring.
Absolutely. So are there any signs or predictors that you look for that are going to help you determine what a year is going to be?
Well, variations in weather. The years where it looks like somebody photocopied a weather report and it's that way like every day, I find the wines tend to be a little boring. I like contrast. I like things, cold springs and maybe unusual rain patterns, and even years where there's been some smoke. If the smoke doesn't get into the vineyards, it tends to obscure the sun, and it changes the skin thickness and delays ripening. Some vintages have a lot of seeds, others don't. It's really, really hard to predict what's going to be a great year, because, we've only really been making, most of these wines for less than 50 years. And there's still a lot to learn. I just hope that we don't screw it up in the winery and then let the vintage play out, and 2 or 3 years down the road say, hey, that's way better than I thought.
Yeah, we get more hindsight of how a vintage is than foresight. Yep. So I'm curious, when you were a little boy, what did you want to be when you grew up?
A fighter pilot.
Huh.
I was really interested in airplanes. I could look at an airplane in the sky and tell you what model it was, and the engine capacity and how far it could fly and all these other goofy things. Except then one day we're driving around and, my father gave me, what do you want to do, boy? Speech. And I'm like, I'm thinking about joining the Air Force and becoming a fighter pilot. And he goes, you're not a pilot. You really can't. You don't have it, boy. Because he went through World War II, and he goes, I've known a lot of fighter pilots, and you don't have it. And I'm like, nah, but I want to. And so right he was.
You're much better at making wine and drinking it.
I chose wisely.
So when you're not making wine and working, how do you spend your free time?
Well, I like mountain biking. I took up golf in the middle of COVID. Watching golf on TV is kind of dangerous. And I thought, those guys are having a ball. And I ordered a set of golf clubs online. And I started playing golf, which I really enjoy. Traveling. It's really exciting to be back on the road again and come down to World of Pinot Noir and see people and talk and go out to restaurants and stuff. But sort of like, golly! So that's really fun. I'm going to France next month for a little 9-day trip. We're going to go to Paris and Burgundy and the Loire and Bordeaux. Another wine trip.
Amazing.
So between traveling and golf and mountain biking and hanging out with the family, I don't know. I've noticed as I get older, the days seem to be getting a lot shorter. Mm-hmm. It's like 15 hours instead of 24 now.
So, in between the life of luxury that you have of golf and travel, and then the busy of work, when you're planning a romantic evening for you and Anne, and of course, you're both wine people, what sort of wines make for a romantic evening for the two of you?
Anne is absolutely in love with Barolo. So probably somewhere around the 20-year-old Barolos would be the apogee. Mm-hmm. So I personally would want to start with vintage champagne, and then we'd think about dinner, maybe lamb chops, which go really well with Pinot Noir, maybe a fire, watch a movie.
And then the Barolo comes out.
Yeah. We have to arm wrestle each other for the last glass.
So, when you think about your life, your career, or your life, we're all given advice throughout our childhood and our careers. Is there a piece of advice someone gave you on how you try to live your life or approach your work?
That's a really good question. Authenticity was something that I was really fascinated by, and it certainly relates to wine. And I worked with a guy named Ken Dice, who was the winemaker at Flora Springs, and he was very much about making wines that were true to the place. And I took that to heart, but I also realized that it was so much easier to be nice to people. When I was coming up in the business, particularly having come from restaurant work, there was this sort of you would call it a caricature of the angry chef, right? The screamer, the pan throwing, never good enough. And I knew a few winemakers like that as well. And their staff was petrified. Nobody wanted to work with them. The growers didn't want to meet them in the field and talk about viticulture because they'd always get spanked. And I realized that it's a partnership, and if I'm going to try to get literally hundreds of people to help me make great wine, we work with 35 growers, and there's literally 75 individual vineyards. Wow. There's armies of people that are necessary to pull this winemaking thing off, that I had to motivate them and want them to, first of all, work really hard on making excellence, but know that I appreciated them. Mm-hmm. And so I can get testy and mad at people when they deserve it. But I would say my number one goal is to try to get people to work harder and do better at what they do by inspiring them and giving them confidence that their labor is going to be respected and appreciated.
I love that. And if you could give our listeners a piece of advice, what kind of advice would you want to share?
Buy as good a wine as you can afford.
I like that. So when you look back at your career, what would you say is one of your proudest achievements to date?
Proudest achievements. I think forming Patz Hall. We, the two families started it. I was 30 years old, and I think when you do something really, really risky, it's really helpful to be younger because
you have a longer time to catch up.
There's a reason that soldiers are 18. And so I think the thing that I'm most stoked about is that we actually made a successful business. I think we very easily could have been a hobby project, a little 200 case garagista thing, and boy, we made great wine, but making it a commercial success, and I didn't really know much about business at all, but I was the winemaker and the CFO, and by golly, it was like a brand new world to me. And that, making it a financial success and being able to buy more grapes from my favorite growers, and then it sounds kind of corny, but spreading more beautiful wine around the world was, I was like, yes, this is great.
Well, keep doing it. Please keep doing it. So I want you to imagine a situation. We're sitting at a table, and we have a bottle. Well, we have a bottle of your wine right here. We have the Pinot Noir, the Bootlegger's Hill. Perhaps it's this wine at the table. Perhaps it's another one. Who would you want to be sharing from any walk of life? It could be personal, it could be famous, but who would you want to be drinking a bottle of wine with you?
I've had the pleasure of having dinner with Aubert de Villaine a couple of times, and I have to really control myself with that because I don't geek out too much. So tell me more about that 95 vintage. But he is such a gentleman and a fascinating character and one of my heroes in the wine business. Another gentleman that I hold in huge regard is Piero Antinori. One thing, my father, who was a creative writer, he had his favorite authors, and he would reread the books. And they were very inspiring for him. And so I looked for people in the wine business that I wanted to follow and study and, how did they do it? And the Antinoris were certainly one of them. I mean, 600 years, 26 generations, they're doing something right. Mm-hmm. And so I would love to have dinner with him. That would be really interesting. Mm-hmm. And then I've always had a thing for Catherine Deneuve. So how big can the party be again?
As big as you want, the table, as long as you have enough wine. So I'm curious, when I had asked you a question about the space aliens and you started to go off on a path of wines that were not your own, now is your chance to do that. You're going to a deserted island. This island is whatever makeup you want, so don't worry about power, electricity, heat, ice, whatever. But what 3 bottles would you want to take?
We're only staying a day?
Just 3 hours.
Oh, okay. Well, I think I would start with either vintage champagne, maybe Krug. I really, really like Chablis. So probably maybe a Le Clos or something like that. And then probably finish with maybe like an older Barolo, maybe Conterno, as long as we're throwing down the big bucks, or maybe Bordeaux. I started my first collection for Bordeaux, and I still love old Bordeaux. And they travel so well.
So you mentioned that you are off to France on a journey. So, I was going to ask you what's next on your bucket list, but it sounds like you're off to France. Is there anywhere else in this wine world that you want to go explore?
Yes. So I've never been to Sicily. I'd really like to go there. And let's see, Corsica. I was having lunch in France, and there was a wine critic, can't remember his name, and he'd just come back from Corsica, and he spent the entire lunch telling everyone how amazing Corsican wines were and how the food was fantastic and the scenery was so beautiful. So I put that on the list. And I was going to travel to Japan this year, but that got canceled, and I'm particularly interested in trying some Japanese wines. I went to a sake tasting 3 weeks ago and absolutely captivated by the quality and the range of aromas and flavors, and so going to Japan on a sake tour and then checking out some of the white wines would be really fun.
Very fun. Okay, it's time for our little game where we pair wine and music. You can give me a genre, you can give me a specific artist, whatever you're comfortable with. We're going to base it on some of your wines. So I started out earlier drinking your Brut sparkling wine, and I'm curious what kind of music it conjures up for you.
Brut, so energetic and positive. I listen to a lot of jazz, but I think that's more like a rock and roll kind of energy. So maybe like Stevie Ray Vaughan or something, some nice driving blues.
Okay. Your absolute favorite Chardonnay, the Hyde Vineyard?
Larry Hyde listens to a lot of classical music, and that wine is so composed and so elegant. I would think like Beethoven's Ninth.
Now, you said that one of your largest production is your Sonoma Coast.
Yes.
So let's look at your Pinot Noir Sonoma Coast.
Yes. That has so many interesting vineyards in it to me, and it's quite different every year because the proportions from each vineyard are different, and the way the climate over the entire Sonoma Coast it really does represent the whole Sonoma Coast. I would say that's more like improvisational jazz. Maybe like blue and green off of the Miles Davis album, kind of blue.
I like it. One more. You're so good at this. One more.
Not really.
We have the 2018 Bootleggers Hill Pinot Noir, Sonoma County, Russian River Valley. So this is one of your vineyard specific. Tell me what, and I'm going to tell you if I can taste it while I'm, if I can hear it while I'm tasting it.
So one of my favorite instruments is the mandolin for some reason. I'm not sure why. And one of my favorite artists is a guy named David Grisman. And he has this music called dog music that he's created. And so it's kind of like bluegrass jazz. And to me, Bootleggers Hill kind of evokes this, Tennessee Woods thing. So I think the mandolin fits.
I love it.
But it's not just finger picking, bluegrass music. It's got a lot more behind it, a lot more modulations and changes. So I would go with a David Grisman song.
I love it. Well, James, you've been amazing. Amazing. It's been a pleasure listening to you, hearing your story. Final question. While you're planning your trip to France and ultimately to Corsica, Sicily, and Japan, I'm curious if people come to Sonoma and they want to seek you out, how can they find Patz Hall both in person or, online or elsewhere?
Well, we are distributed internationally, so our Sonoma Coast wines are widely available. Some of the single vineyards are sold on premise, specifically the Hyde Vineyard Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Chenoweth Ranch, Gap's Crown Pinot. But the best way is to come to our tasting salon. It's called the Sonoma House at Patz Hall, and it's located right next door to the winery. And it's this Tuscan villa that has views of the mountains. And it's, our portfolio is a bit of a geography lesson because the names of the vineyards are usually family names, but the location and where the grapes are from is very, very important. So when you come, our wine educators will help decipher the North Coast and Mendocino. We have a website called patzhall.com, patzhall.com, and most of the wines are available there as well. Also library wines, so if you're interested in magnums or cellar-aged wines, you can find those on the website. So the best way is to come visit. Second best is to go to a restaurant that has the wine or go online and buy it that way.
Well, fantastic, James. Thank you so much for joining us on Wine Soundtrack, and cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to a new episode of Wine Soundtrack USA. For details and updates, visit our website, winesoundtrack.com.